Our next pair of speakers are Dorothy Schaadt and Lina Duiker. Dorothy, both were advised by Professor John Lipsky, and they both went to Palenque to collect the data, and then to Radboud University in Nijmegen to actually conduct their prior experience. Dorothy is a major in Spanish and a minor in labor and employment relations. And like Lina is a major in philosophy and Spanish, and she is going for a minor in women's studies. And they are going to be talking about lengua palenquera.
Okay, hi, my name is Lina.
I'm Dorothy.
And we're going to be talking about lengua palenquera.
So our presentation is going to be a little bit different than the others because we conducted field research, so it wasn't in a lab. We're also going to have a lot more pictures, so hopefully it'll be fun. So first off, what is palenquero? Well, in the 1600s, African slaves were brought over to the port of Cartagena, which is in the north of Colombia, by the Spanish. A group of those slaves then escaped from the Spanish and went on to found a small town, which is called San Basilio de Palenque, which is where we spent our time. These people who escaped came from different parts of Africa, therefore they had no common language between them. And as I'm sure most of you know, when that happens, oftentimes a Creole language will develop out of necessity to communicate. So Palenquero is a Creole language that has Spanish-derived vocabulary with obvious influences of Kikongo and other Central African Bantu languages, which would have been the native languages of those escaped slaves. A couple of these interesting characteristics of Palenquero, which we'll be talking about today. I'll be talking about clause final negation.
And I put down that there's absence of grammatical gender and nominal plural marking. I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be talking about the preverbal particles system. So one of the interesting characteristics of lengua palenquera is that there was actually stigmatization in the 20th century. So when people were using lengua palenquera, they would oftentimes be ridiculed and mocked because of their language, because people thought that they were speaking Spanish incorrectly. That people didn't realize that it was a different language. But however, when this guy who's on the slide, when he's a boxer from Palenque, and when he won, I believe it was
The 70s.
Yeah, I think it was in the 70s. Yeah, when he won this boxing competition, then there was all of a sudden like a lot of interest in Palenque. They were all like, oh, like this is so cool. There's like this little village. There's all this cool stuff that's going on over here. We want to know more about it. And so UNESCO actually declared Palenque a World Heritage Site. And after this happened, and after there was all of this interest in Palenque, all of a sudden there was like a revitalization period. So people started becoming more interested, people started learning more about the language, and we realized that it's really interesting. So now they're actually teaching Palenque in schools, Palenquero in the schools there. However, there's no instruction in grammar, and there's no systematic critique or feedback in the schools. So basically, we went to a couple classes while we were there, and so we got to sit in and listen to like how they teach. And from my experience, basically what they were doing is just memorizing different like poems or things like that, and then just reading them in front of the class or reciting them. So that isn't really a very effective way of learning the grammar, and then I think you can definitely see that through our results. So what is it like to work in Palenque? So these are just some different pictures of Palenque and the differences. So in the top middle picture, you can kind of see how some of our research was conducted. That's one of our friends who came with us. She's from the University of Michigan. And so basically what we would do is we would conduct our research just in the middle of the living room that we had. There was tons of noise in the background, pigs running through, just like all kinds of noise, which made it a little bit, it's just like an interesting environment to do research in, just having all those distractions, and it's normal for them, so they didn't think anything of it. I was sitting there, I was super distracted by everything. Thankfully, I didn't have to do the tasks, so it didn't really matter. But yeah, these are some pictures of us conducting research. And yeah, we would just sit there with our laptops and just have them do the tests.
So I will present my research first. So Pitt is the best university in Pennsylvania. Not. This is a great example of how we can use in English this clause final negation that I'll be talking about. So while we use this for these silly little jokes, what would happen if a language actually used negation in this way? Well, as I've told you, Palenquero does. So we see that this is a possible placement for negation, but how practical or efficient is it? That's what I looked into this summer to see if the placement of clause final negation in lengua palenquera had an effect on how efficiently it's processed by L2 learners, which I believed that it would be. So here's a good example of Palenquero negation. You can see I have nu is the negation marker in Palenquero, so ita habla castellano nu, and in Spanish yo no estoy hablando castellano. You can also see that there are obvious similarities, habla, hablando, castellano, castellano. That's where that Spanish vocabulary comes in. It's important to note that Palenque is a bilingual community, so they speak both Spanish and Palenquero on the streets, which makes this a perfect place to study clause final negation, as all other factors are accounted for, because the languages have the same basic word order and very similar vocabulary, the one big difference being Spanish has preverbal negation and Palenquero clause final. So the participants that we ran, which we actually ran about 52 participants in a little over a week, so it was very quick, multiple, like, 5 to 10 participants a day. So we had 2 different groups for my task. I had adult heritage speakers, which were people who had spoken lengua palenquera since childhood. They speak both Spanish and lengua. And then L2 learners, which are native Spanish speakers who, through this revitalization period that Lina talked about, are just now learning this language in the community and in school. I actually did 2 tasks. I'm only going to have time to talk about one today, which is the memory-loaded repetition task. There were 3 parts to this task, the first being that my participants would hear a sentence in lengua palenquera, either affirmative or negative, which they had been previously prompted to keep that sentence in their mind to be able to repeat it later. Second, they had their distractor, which was a short video clip, about 10 seconds, and then followed by 10 seconds where I asked them to just comment something that they had seen in the video, whatever they wanted to say. They were then prompted to repeat that sentence from the beginning. So the purpose of this task was to see how often that idea of negation was lost, and I was able to do that by looking at how many negative sentences were repeated as affirmative sentences. I had 20 stimuli with 15 affirmative clauses and 9 negative. So some results that I found, adults versus L2 learners for the negative sentences, I did find there was a significant difference. The adults, 81% of the time, gave a correct response where they heard a negative sentence and repeated a negative sentence, whereas the L2 learners only 58% of the time were able to repeat that negation, showing that it was being lost in their processing. I then looked into, within my sentences, I had some sentences that were probably negative. So an example would be, in Colombia, English is the most widely spoken language, not. It leads towards negation. And other sentences that were just completely ambiguous could go one way or another. So interestingly, at least in this task, I didn't find a significant difference between the probably negative or the ambiguous sentences in the adults or in the L2 learners. The only difference that I found were in the probably negative sentences between the adults and the L2 learners. I also did a translation task, actually the data that Lina collected. I'm still working on analyzing that, so hopefully maybe I'll find some more results there.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. So I was looking at the preverbal particle system. So the preverbal particles in lengua palenquera, they indicate past, present, future, just the tense. So whereas in Spanish, you conjugate the verb, estoy hablando, I am talking, or voy a hablar, or that's indicating the future. In lengua palenquera, there's no conjugation of the actual verb. They just have the preverbal particle that indicates what tense the verb is in. Sometimes there are bare verbs, but we're not really going to be looking at that today. However, Actually, John Lipsky, our advisor, he's gone to Palenque before, and he has found that it seems that there's a misuse of the particles. People will use them in the wrong places, and then sometimes they'll actually use two preverbal particles at the same time. So, for example, some people will use atan. So a is indicating preterite, and tan indicates future. So it makes absolutely zero sense for them to use it in the same sentence for the same verb. And yet a lot of young learners especially are using two at the same time. In my data, I've actually found people who have used at least three because they'll use ba at the end. So they'll say like atan and then verb ba at the end. So they'll use three, so it just doesn't make any sense. So that's what I'm looking at. And so the participants that I had, I actually had them split up into 4 categories. There's the adult heritage learners, the traditional speakers, young heritage learners, and L2 speakers. So I did this because I'm really very interested in the heritage learners specifically. So I was really interested in that basically because of the stigmatization period that happened. So the adult heritage learners, they learned the language when they were children, but then they were repeatedly taught that they weren't supposed to speak lingua, that it was a bad thing for them to be speaking lingua. So then they stopped using it for a period, and then when it was revitalized, then they started using it more often. So they kind of like reached back into their memory to remember how to speak lingua correctly. So there's going to be some interesting linguistic things that are happening there. The traditional speakers, they learned lingua when they were younger, and they kept on using it their entire lives. So they're normally the ones that will be that you'll see like on the side of the road just talking in lingua with each other. The young heritage learners are younger people that have learned lingua at home, and then now they're also learning it in school because of the revitalization program. And then the L2 speakers are people that might not necessarily have that influence at home, but they're learning it in the schools. However, for the purpose of analyzing my data, now I grouped the adult and traditional speakers together. I had 18 total of those, and then I grouped the young heritage learners and the L2 speakers together, and I had 34 total participants there. So the tasks that I had for them, they had to translate lingua to Spanish, and then they also had to translate Spanish to lingua. So they would hear a stimuli, for example, in Spanish, and then they would be given, there would be like a beep, and then they would have to translate it into lingua. So I have analyzed the first part, the first task of Spanish to lingua, because that's where the really interesting stuff I think is going to happen, just because they're going to have to produce the preverbal particles there. So we had stimuli in all the different tenses, and then they also had different subjects. So I used like, I did this, you did that, all that in every single tense. So some examples of what we had were los cerdos están corriendo por las calles, the pigs are running through the streets. And then you can read all the rest of them. For that first one, because it's in the present tense, there wouldn't be a preverbal particle there. That's just how lingua works. And then for the next ones, then there would be preverbal particles either before, or sometimes if there's a ba, then that would be present at the end of the verb. So for today, I brought the things that I've analyzed for the present tense. So in these instances, they shouldn't have used preverbal particles at all. So my results, so this is the young L2 Palenquero speakers, and these are the adult. And as you can see, the adult Palenquero speakers, they had the highest percentage of correct answers. So this is when they didn't use any preverbal particle at all, which is what we would expect. But if you look at the young L2 Palenquero speakers, they're just all over the place. So the majority did say that there was none, but then a lot of them gave just inappropriate responses. So they either didn't answer at all, or they just gave a response that was completely like not translating correctly, something like that. And then they also did have some instances where they used multiple preverbal particles. So as you can see, the atan is right there. It's almost 10% of responses that were given, they used atan. So that's very interesting. I don't know really why that is happening, but when I was conducting tasks, I would listen. We would normally have like 4 or 5 people come at the same time. So then some people would be sitting in the background talking while one person was taking the test. And so I got to hear how they were talking with each other. And sometimes before students would come and take my task, I would hear them asking their peers, "What does tan mean? What does suto mean?" And I'd be like, this is like exactly what I'm looking at, because tan is a preverbal future particle. And the fact that they didn't know what it meant before coming to take my task and they had to ask their friends right before indicates to me that perhaps they aren't learning what these things mean in school. So that might be something that they have to work on when teaching Palenquero in schools, because the grammar isn't being taught to these people, so they don't know. They just will say, for example, I believe that some people would say like atan just because tan, they know that tan is Palenquero. So they say, oh, I have to translate this into lengua. I know that tan is lengua, so I'll just throw it in there to make it sound like it's lengua. And then with the adult speakers, there were some instances where they did use atan. A lot of people did use just by itself. But it's, yeah, I don't really know why that's happening. I think it might be a little bit based on the adult heritage learners who had that kind of stigmatization period. I'm not really sure. I'm going to have to look into that. But yeah, that's basically the results that I had. And so we both, after we went to Colombia, we got to go to Nijmegen, the Netherlands, with Pyre. And so we got to spend 2 months there. We were analyzing data under the supervision of Dr. Peter Moiskin of Radboud University. So we got to meet with him a couple times, get his input on our research, and then we also got to meet with some of his graduate students. And yeah, we went to a lot of talks and all that kind of stuff, just like trying to learn a lot about what we're doing. So yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
So there is time for questions. Jonathan.
It's really interesting that the adult heritage speakers, like you say, sometimes do use particles when you don't expect them. Are there any speakers you think might be worth analyzing on their own? Like, are there any high proficiency Palenquero speakers that might have a different pattern than the heritage speakers? Because it might be interesting to see if they are using no particles categorically, or if they still show some variation as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be looking specifically at just traditional speakers. I'm going to split them up more so that I can kind of see whether there is a difference. However, there aren't a lot of traditional speakers that are willing to take the tests, because they are normally the older, more traditional people, and they don't, they just aren't interested in taking the tasks. So we don't really have a lot of responses in that from traditional speakers, but I'm definitely going to split them up so that I can see whether it's something with the adult heritage speakers or not. I know that we tested one gentleman who is a traditional speaker, but he basically kind of just changes lengua to fit what he wants it to. So it's just an interesting community where some people will be convinced that they're speaking lengua correctly and that they know exactly how they're supposed to speak lengua, and yet they're changing things, adding Spanish in there. I will definitely be splitting them up to look at the different.
Other questions?
I have a question about, you see that with the preterite?
Yeah.
Do you think there's something about the task that might have induced them to use the preterite?
Well...
So it's interesting that it was so high on both sides. That's the most frequent mistake, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure. I'll look back at that, but I did notice that too, and I think it might, at least for the young speakers, I think that it might go back to what I was saying about how tan and are obviously lengua when you use that before the actual verb. So I'm not exactly sure why. That's why it's really interesting that the adult heritage speakers and the adults were using that so often too. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I could guess that it's because of that. But yeah, I'll look back and see if there's anything that could have induced, because I can't think of anything, but maybe.
What just comes to me when people repeat things, if I said, I'll be right back, I'm going to the bathroom. He said, what did he say? He said he was going to the bathroom. You know, that would be the natural way to do it in English. I have no idea how this language works, but sometimes people switch the preterite when reporting discourse.
Yeah, I don't know if that would have, I mean, I don't know, because the specific sentences were just in the present.
Yeah.
So even from what I was seeing just throughout, like all of it, even in like future and all of those, it seemed like "al" was used a lot more than almost any other particle. "An," "than" were used the most, just like randomly. So I don't know if it's something with how they're learning how to speak the language, or if it's just like a habit that has come about. Yeah, I don't know.
Yes.
So I'm interested in that fact that you didn't see differences between the totally unambiguous negation and the ambiguous one. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I really expected to find something because, you know, sentences that I had, they were, you could even say some of them were false, like English being the most, you know, widely spoken language in Colombia, that's false. So I don't really know. I'm interested to see. I have Lina's translation data that I also had her do negative sentences in that so that I could use that same data without having to test more participants. So I'm very close to being able to see that within the next week or so. I should hope to have those results. So I'll be interested to see if maybe in that task, I don't know, this was a difficult task. A lot of people had problems even just doing it. So I don't know if it was just too difficult of a task that it really kind of messed them up, and maybe with an easier task like just straight translating, I'll find that effect there or not.
Other questions? So yeah, I have a comment because there is time. So I was going to ask a question about the task, because they had the sentence and then they had to hold something in memory, the sentence in memory, and then they had to describe whatever happened, and then they had to repeat. It is possible that, you know, some of the meaning gets lost simply. I mean, the negation is something that you wouldn't think gets lost easily, because, you know, when you're giving your kids permission not to go somewhere, you know, to say no at the end means no. But the truth is that, you know, the parents of these, you know, youngsters don't necessarily speak to them in Palenquero. So it's something that they don't hear often, at least, you know, in terms of, when you think about asking for permission or I'm going here and there, and parents say, no, you can't do that, it probably will be communicated in Spanish. So yeah. I wonder if not having the memory task might say something about, not necessarily about, might get closer to whether in fact they understand that this is, so it's not about difficulty of putting negation at the end, if there are other cues that might help them figure out what people are saying.
It's also interesting to me, just one second, I'm not even sure in their spoken language if they use negation very often. They might take those sentences and flip them around so that they're mostly saying positive sentences. So they might not even have, you know, practice using negation. I don't know enough to know.
John, can you comment on that?
Well, I read the whole battery of experiments and found that in the aggregate there is a little bit of difference, but I think Dorothy's right that for the memory learning repetition, for some folks, the whole task was daunting. But the few times I've heard like older people talk to the kids, it's exactly the negative commands that they're doing in lengua, like don't do this, don't do that. Everything else I've talked to them in Spanish.
So maybe because the negation is at the end, and I feel that this is what I'm. All right, we need to move on, but thank you very much.